And this week, we've got Jordan James Lindsay and Chris Yeomans, who will be talking us through the application of machine learning approaches to opportunities in minerals exploration. Jordan currently works at Minviro as a sustainability analyst, and Chris works across two roles as a research manager at Cornish Lithium and a research fellow at the University of Exeter. So I'll hand over to Jordan first for his talk, Machine Learning Approaches and Metallogenesis.
Yeah, so thank you to the Deep Digital team for inviting me today. My name is Jordan, and as mentioned, I currently work with Minviro as a sustainability analyst, but I also recently submitted my PhD thesis to CSM. And there I was using machine learning to investigate precious metal signatures in volcanic and magmatic products around the world. So my talk today is mostly going to be about my thesis, with maybe like a little bit about how I'm hoping to apply machine learning to my current role. And for the talk today, I'm going to sort of try and aim down the middle of the geology stuff and the machine learning stuff. So it'll be an overview of each. If you have any questions, if you want more details about each of the sections, please do let me know. But it's going to be mostly an overview of my project with a sort of machine learning focus. So a bit about me. I did my BSc in Earth Science at Glasgow, followed by a mining geology masters at CSM, and I stayed on there to do my PhD in geochemistry. And always liked igneous petrology and chemistry combined into geochemistry, and it was a perfect PhD for me. I've collaborated with Hannah Hughes, Jens Andersen, and Chris Yeomans. And what you'll notice here is that none of my credentials are maths-based or computer science-based. So the sort of gist of my talk is to say that machine learning is applicable to a load of different problems and accessible to anyone, no matter what your background. So why do I study precious metals, and specifically the platinum group elements or metals, the PGE? They're some of the rarest metals on Earth, but they're really important for a lot of modern technology, including hydrogen fuel cells. Locations where they are concentrated in Earth include Skagerrak in Greenland, Norilsk in Russia, and Bushveld in South Africa. And these locations share a few features in common. They are sites where there's intraplate magmatism. So that is volcanism not associated to plate margins, sort of just in the middle of tectonic plates. And it's areas of thick continental crust. So my PhD is trying to decipher these clues, look at reasons why the PGE would be concentrated in these places, and what is the mantle contribution to the metal contents. So the PGE, if you're not familiar with them, are a group of 6 metals. They're really heavy, really dense, and during the formation of Earth, the majority of them sank to the core. So this is one of the reasons why they're so rare at the surface, because the majority of them are locked up somewhere inaccessible. Although there's a lot of research that suggests that they are also concentrated beneath continents in the subcontinental lithospheric mantle, or the SCLM. And I mentioned earlier interplate magmatism. This can be related to mantle plumes, which are hot upwellings of material from inside the mantle that rise to the surface and cause volcanism there. Now, these features can interact with both the core and the SCLM. So the thinking behind my PhD is that there might be a link between these features that may transfer some of these metals to the surface at the locations I mentioned. So this is the sort of focus of my PhD. And sort of came up with 2 hypotheses that I wanted to test. The first one was that deep plumes, which originate from near the core, would be expected to have more metals that they might be able to scavenge from the depths. And hypothesis 2, that plumes close to or within the continental crust and the SCLM will have different PGE ratios from one that was sort of appearing in the middle of the ocean, not attached to this possible reservoir. And you'll see here there's certain localities around the world that I'm applying to each of the hypotheses. So I won't go into too much depth with these, but I'll just give an overview. Hypothesis 1, plumes can come from different depths in the Earth. They can be different shapes, they can be different sizes, they can have different properties. So the first hypothesis is just we're hoping to show that each of these plumes around the world will have different PGE contents theoretically. And this diagram sort of suggests that. Hypothesis 2 is a little bit more complicated, but essentially we want to test this subcontinental lithospheric mantle theory that the metals are potentially being scavenged from there. So in the South Atlantic, South America and Africa used to be conjoined, and a plume arrived underneath the continents, caused loads of melting and erupted a massive volume of lava onto the surface. This area is known as the P-lip. Now, with time, as we know, Africa and South America are now separate. So rifting drove the continents apart. The volcanism continued in between. And what happened is that we've got this perfect situation to test the theory that we had a plume that was in the continent, and then the continent was removed and the lavas continued to erupt. So what I'd be hoping to, what I was doing through my PhD was looking at volcanism through this entire sequence and looking at the difference in chemistry. We also have the same situation in the North Atlantic, centered around the Icelandic plume. Hopefully you can see the similarities in this diagram between these two slides here, that we had two continents, Greenland and Northern Europe, rifted, volcanism in between, and again, we're able to sample the lavas from each section of this sequence and see if their geochemistry is different, and most importantly for me, if their platinum group elements are different. So yeah, so throughout my PhD, I gathered lavas from a load of different places around the world, listed them here. I've basically crushed the lavas down, analysed them through loads of different means to analyse what elements were contained within the lavas. So it was essentially a bulk geochemical comparison between all these different lava types that I was looking into. And with time, I started to gather a bigger and bigger and bigger database with more samples, like sometimes up to 50 elements for each sampled measure. So with time, I was starting to maybe panic that I had to start analysing and comparing all these different lavas. And as my work continued, this is when I became familiar with machine learning algorithms. So as I mentioned, I've never had any experience with maths and computer science. So as my PhD was progressing, I was looking for novel ways to look at my data, especially because my database was getting so big. With normal geochemistry, what you do is you plot two elements together, as you can see on the left-hand side, and that's quite easy for a human brain to process, potentially 3 dimensions. But machine learning gives you a means for looking at way more than this at once. We can't really comprehend what a 50-element axis would look like, but machine learning can do that for us and look for patterns that we might not be able to perceive. So as my database grew, it became apparent that machine learning would be something quite useful to look at all these different lavas that I'd gathered. So I'm sure this would be covered in the previous talks, but I'll give a brief overview in terms of the context for my study. Machine learning is a data science tool used to process and recognize patterns in large data sets. You can have supervised algorithms, which you require, you train the algorithm on some of your data to make predictions about the rest. You have unsupervised algorithms, which don't need any training and can look for patterns immediately. And you have reinforcement learning, which is a sort of balance between exploiting patterns and exploring for new ones. Now, everything from Netflix recommendations, medical diagnostics, facial recognition, undiscovered door targeting, so much, there's so many applications of machine learning in modern society, but it's often viewed as a black box approach. A lot of people view it as this sort of magical process. You chuck your data in and it gives you stuff out, and that can put off a lot of people. As many articles as you see talking about how good machine learning is, you'll get another one like this one up the top saying it's causing a science crisis. And I've definitely met some resistance in conferences I've been to when you try to talk about machine learning within the context of geology. Some people just don't really like the idea of it, which is fair enough. But I'm hoping to show with my talk that as long as you sort of have an appreciation for what the process is doing, it can really be applied to so many different fields and give you a new perspective on even old data that you've already got. So yeah, as I mentioned, geochemistry and geology overall isn't really something that's been tied to machine learning massively in the past, but recently it's getting a lot of traction. I've put some papers here on the side that are really cool ones I've found in the last, while I was doing my PhD. Got some references at the end, but essentially there's been some cool studies mapping lunar basalts, looking at Martian geochemistry, looking at lineaments in Cornwall to try and find undiscovered ores. There's a whole bunch of applications for it. And it's a massive, as you can see with this diagram, it's a huge field. There's so many different parts to it. And I was only really looking at big data visualization and meaningful compression within the unsupervised learning camp. And in the end, even though my PhD wasn't focused on that initially, I ended up that 3 of my chapters in my thesis were machine learning based because I just found it so useful for trying to address this problem of what I was looking to do, PGE varying around the globe. And essentially, I created this workflow, which was the main thing I need to highlight is that the machine learning isn't replacing traditional geochemistry, which is, again, people are a bit kind of, you can't just replace traditional stuff with new things and ignore all the science from before. So essentially we designed this workflow to go in tandem. On the left side, you've got the traditional aspects of geochemistry, different things that you'd look at in isolation to inform your overall model of a system. And on the right-hand side, we've got the machine learning parts. So I'll explain these in more depth in the next few slides, but essentially I used PCA, t-SNE, and k-means clustering. And we tested this study. It's now published in Geoscience Frontiers down the bottom, and we've got a follow-up that's been accepted, applied to a different set of geochemical rocks in Earth Science Systems and Society. And yeah, I'll go through the results that we got in each of these. So PCA stands for Principal Component Analysis. It's technically a data science tool for dimensionality reduction. Sometimes it falls within machine learning bracket, depends who you talk to, but essentially it's a tool for looking at variability in your data. And what it does is it looks at your big cloud of 50 dimensional data, however many variables you have, and looks for the direction of maximum variability in the samples, and it defines this as a principal component. Then it looks perpendicular to this, and that's the second one, perpendicular to this, that's the third one. You end up with these new features, principal components, which describe how your data varies within your whole database. And essentially it creates these biplot figures over here, which show you how your elements vary within your system, which elements vary in a similar way. So you can see these arrows, you've got certain elements will have very similar variabilities, and you can start to think of geological processes that would group these elements together. And you can see the samples in the background, they also apply to the variability directions. So it's quite handy for starting off if you've got loads of different elements, bringing this down to much less. So it's called dimensionality reduction is the sort of name of the game here. We also have t-SNE, which stands for t-SNE Distributed Stochastic Neighbor Embedding. Nearly messed that up there. And this is essentially like PCA, but it analyzes all your variability for all your elements and all your samples at once and puts them in a 2D plot. And this can act as a map of overall variability in your data set. And it produces these really nice plots that I use extensively through my PhD, so that points that are close to each other on this map have a high degree of similarity through all your variables at the once, and things that are far apart might be a bit different. And you can overlay this map with other information, geographical information, cluster information, to see how everything behaves in the context of the grand scale of variability. And the third one I used in the workflow is k-means clustering. So this is similar to t-SNE, and it looks at the similarity in your samples to all the dimensions at once, but it then creates clusters or classifications based on these similarities. So you can see this little moving GIF at the bottom of the page here. It starts with a sort of random formation of how to group together your samples, and it keeps iterating and moving this until it has the optimum density cluster. So you can see here, it's easier to see in the GIF than talk about the maths. It keeps going until it's got the optimized statistical groups. So these are the three techniques that I used in tandem, and they inform each other. You can use the results from each one in aspects of the others, and so there's quite a good synergy between the techniques within the studies. And as I said, the first study we tested it on is in the North Atlantic. So this was the Icelandic plume. We had samples from Greenland, the UK, and Iceland, and we analysed all the geochemistry for them. We had 11 elements measured for this one. And essentially the three techniques combined to define three geochemical clusters within our data set. We have one that seemed to be dominated by titanium, copper, and palladium variability. We had a neutral one, which didn't really have any strong signatures in any variabilities. And we had a third one, which had sort of elements that are associated with high degrees of partial melting and olivine accumulation. And when we overlaid our geographical information, the machine learning obviously doesn't know where the samples are, but there was a good overlap between samples from Greenland, samples from the UK, and the newer rocks from Iceland. But the important finding from this study was that platinum itself varied completely independently from any of these trends. There was something more local controlling the variability for this element. In the South Atlantic, we had a similar data set, but we had 50 elements measured. So we had samples from the Brazil side, from the African side, and from the ridges out in the middle of the ocean. And you can see these really cool biplots. We had all our 50 elements. You can see what elements varied in a similar way. There's some predictable things here, like all the rare earths tend to bunch together. A lot of the base metals bunch together, but you can start to see that the samples are starting to group. You've got like a purple cluster in the top left. We've got a kind of dark blue cluster. So the machine learning was able to sort of draw out really relevant patterns within the data set immediately using PCA. This transferred over to TISNE, and at this time we had two major PGE bearing trends within the groups, and some areas which had very strong heavy PGE and some areas that had very strong light PGE variation. And again, the geographic information that we already had, when you overlaid this on top of the TISNE information, it actually made quite a lot of sense, and you started to see that the PGE contents were varying geographically, geophysically, and spatially with time. And this is the sort of implications from those two studies. There was an overlap in the two systems in that the majority of the PGE were behaving in a geographical sense. They were varying systematically, but platinum was being a bit strange. It seemed to have something a bit more local about the variability in it. And in the South Atlantic study, which had more elements, platinum was a bit better defined. You could start to attach different processes that were maybe causing it to vary. But the obvious outcome from this study was to chuck both of these data sets in together and see what machine learning thought of this. And for the last chapter of my thesis, I decided to take all the samples I gathered and all the geochemistry and feed them through this workflow to see what conclusions were able to be made. It was kind of a long shot, but we thought we'd try it anyway. And we were pleasantly surprised by the results. This is basically a sketch over one of the TISNE maps for all the samples I'd gathered. And the machine learning was actually able to pick up a certain region and a certain setting, which was continent edge samples, which were conducive to platinum and palladium enrichment. So all the highest variabilities for platinum and palladium in all the samples I gathered from a PhD were restricted to this continent edge location. Places like the Canaries and Hawaii had too low degrees of partial melting to really sort of melt any significant amounts of metals in the magmas. There were some places that were very high degrees of partial melting, but they were out in the middle of the ocean. So on Tonga Java and Iceland, for example, they didn't have any relevant PGE, but the machine learning was able to pick up this feature within our samples, which, was conducive to high degrees of metals. And this feeds into a mineral systems approach to exploration. If you're thinking about exploration, you usually think about drilling holes to try and find something local. But what our study sort of filled in for was the first stage of this mineral systems approach in a global scale. Where are areas that there are a lot of metals? Before you've even considered the ore deposit systems or any crustal processes, are there places where the magmas are simply just more enriched and possibly more conducive to, well, in this case, PGE, metallogenesis? And from our study, we think so. We think this continent edge feature in Paraná and in the North Atlantic there seems to be something about there that the melting conditions are perfect to liberate the PGE here. So this is one of the big findings from my thesis, and machine learning helped me do that. There's probably no way I'd have been able to analyze that amount of samples, that amount of elements in one place without it. And Chris's talk later on will probably go into this mineral system model a bit further in a more regional and local scale. But it is always good to think about mineral exploration in these different levels of sort of scale, I guess, from all the way down at the source right down to where is an ore deposit and why are the metals concentrated in that location. So yeah, if you take anything away from my talk, I would hope it would be that machine learning is accessible to anyone. It's intimidating as a field to think about in terms of coding and computing applications, but really I've never had experience in anything like that, and I found it immensely useful for my study, especially considering how it can be applied for mineral exploration systems. I definitely think it's the way forward for a lot of different geoscience aspects. And the main thing you need to realize with the data when you're using machine learning, which I found, the data has to be treated well before you put it into your algorithms. You can't just chuck geochemical data and I guess spatial data, geophysical data into an algorithm that gives you information out. Everything has to be normalized and tested to make sure that it's applicable, which is easily done. There's statistical methods and calculations to sort of normalize all your data and you can go from there. And yeah, the value added to my PhD via machine learning was immense. As I said, I'd probably have to analyze every element individually against every other element in a big, huge, it would take too long, basically. And machine learning really just supplemented a geochemical study really well. And yeah, if you want any information about how the algorithms work or how they specifically apply to each part of the studies, our paper with Geoscience Frontiers has this workflow, sort of the details of it. And we've got our second one coming out, which is the study with the higher amount of elements and higher amount of samples. So they go quite nicely together. And yeah, I just hope that I've sort of portrayed that if I can do it, anyone can. So thank you for having me today. And if you've got any questions, please let me know.
That's brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Jordan, for that chat. And we've got an interesting question in the chat as well, which I'll read out loud just in case people don't have access to that. If you have a data set with obvious geochemical differences within the data, how effective is PCA and other workflows at isolating more subtle geochemical variations? Do they tend to get lost in the noise?
So this is what I was mentioning at the end. If you put geochemical data in straight away to your algorithms, they usually pick up on the biases that are there already. So if you had mixed unit measurements, so if you had stuff in percent, stuff in ppm, stuff in ppb, the variability would be affected by this. So you have to normalize your data first of all with a common feature. You can use a Z-score, like a standard score, or other statistical means to sort of normalize this to get rid of the noise. And after this stage, I would believe that your PCA information, your t-SNE information would be accurate, and it wouldn't be picking up just on the biases inherent in the data set because of the nature of the geochemistry. This is something we learn through the process. So for example, if you're to put your raw geochemical data into t-SNE, it usually makes a really elongate array, which when I first did it, thought looked really cool. But actually that was because there was a huge bias in the data set. If your t-SNE is more of a round map, a nice sort of even shape, you can be sort of assured that there's no biases in the direction of the data. So yeah, that's just something that's important. And I've been trying to portray this in different talks I've done to geochemists, that you can't just chuck the data in. It has to be treated well and normalized first of all to get rid of this noise, and then everything after that should be relevant.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jordan. And Ed, please just ping a message if anything's extended or come from that answer. Moving on to Alex's question, which may have some kind of some degree of similarity around data preparation. So what degree of data preparation is required before the data can be fed into the machine learning algorithms, i.e. does data have to be leveled, etc.?
Yeah, so that does relate to the last question. As I said, I use Z-scores, which is quite commonly used through a lot of different statistical and mathematical applications. Yeah, there's loads of different ones. I think there's, what's the other one you can use? ILR, something like that. There's different ones you can use, and they do slightly different things, but most of them take into account the mean and the standard deviation of your data set as a whole. And yeah, as long as you normalize this, you should be all right. When you don't normalize it, all your plots that come out at the end of machine learning always look pretty wacky. You'll have all your sort of vectors for your PCA pointing the kind of similar directions. As I said, your t-SNE will be elongate instead of a nice variability map. So it's usually quite obvious if your data is unsuitable. So my advice would be, if I don't know, if you're to run through the samples and something looks a bit weird, if it looks like your machine learning outcomes are biased in a spatial sense, just on your map, there's probably something weird going on, because the whole reason you're using this technique is to get rid of things like that and reduce your dimensionality. So yeah, it's usually quite obvious if the data is not suitable, but as long as you've used some sort of normalization or standardization, you should be good to go.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Jordan. And a point there, just to note that when people have kind of queries that are emerging beyond this workshop, we have got impact fellows who are specialists in artificial intelligence and machine learning techniques who people can come to. And I'm sure maybe Jordan wouldn't even mind if someone pinged him a message if they wanted to expand.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I reckon the machine learning experts will be better than me, but I'm happy to answer anything, especially if it's...
I don't expect so. You've done a sterling job of answering questions that mean very little to my non-technically gifted brain. We've got one more from John Fieldhouse. Jordan, when using k-means clustering, for example, do you have any tips for determining the actual significance of each cluster when they are plotted, e.g. in PCA biplots?
Yeah, so we use a technique, what's it called, the Davies-Bouldin index, which is basically, it's a mathematical calculation which assesses, there's probably a better way to say it, but how good your clusters are, how dense they are, how separated from your other clusters. It takes into account things like this. So what we normally do is I'll run k-means for 2 clusters, 3 clusters, 4 clusters, as many as, usually go up to like 7 or 8, depending on that, based on the sort of amount of data that I've got. And then retrospectively, you can apply this calculations and it will tell you statistically what is the best number of clusters for your k-means model. But also, just because that number's the lowest Davies-Bouldin index, it doesn't mean that that's the be-all and end-all. I think this is when the sort of subjectivity comes into machine learning. We still need to sort of look at things and see if it's suitable for what we're using. If, for example, you're trying to classify data points and statistically the best one is 2 clusters, but you're looking to sort of dive a bit deeper than that, you just need to use your sort of intuition as well. It's a bit of a sort of holistic approach. So the Davies-Bouldin index is really good for telling you what statistically is the best way to set up your model, but you do sort of have to have your own opinion as well. If what the machine learning algorithm thinks is the best, it doesn't suit what you're using, I mean, it's fine to use something else, but at least you know which one is statistically the best.
Brilliant. Thanks again, Jordan.